5 years had passed since the silence of the machines, and Varanthos Prime had been rebuilt from the ashes of war into something stronger than before. The new council chambers stood where the old ones had fallen, constructed from materials donated by every species in known space. And at its heart was a memorial wall that stretched from floor to ceiling, covered with names. Yoon Siren, now Secretary General of the United Earth Government, walked slowly along the wall, reading names she could not pronounce, but whose sacrifice. She understood perfectly Torvak's names, and Ilari names, and names from 100 other species, all mixed together with human names, because in death there was no hierarchy, only shared loss. She paused before one particular entry, a small plaque written in Korean that read simply, Park Minjin, Lieutenant, pilot of the Quiet Resolve, who gave everything. Someone had placed fresh flowers before the plaque, and Siren wondered who had remembered this young man she had never met. He would be proud of what we have built, a voice said behind her. She turned to find High Arbiter Zenith standing there, her crystalline features softened by an expression that might have been sadness or gratitude or both. I hope so, Siren replied. I hope all of them would be proud. They stood together in comfortable silence, two leaders who had once faced each other across an unbridgeable divide, and who now stood as equals. The council convenes in 1 hour, Zenith said finally. There is a motion before us that requires your presence. Siren nodded and followed her toward the great chamber. The hall was filled with delegates from every corner of the galaxy, beings of every shape and size and color, and as Siren entered, they rose in respect, a gesture that still made her uncomfortable after all these years. Zenith took her place at the High Arbiter's seat and called the session to order. We are gathered today to address a wrong that was done 5 years ago, she announced, her musical voice carrying to every corner of the room. When this council voted to strip humanity of its voice, we committed an act of arrogance that nearly cost us everything. She paused, and Siren could see the weight of those words pressing down upon her. Today I move to formally restore humanity's speaking rights, Zenith continued, and to issue an official apology for the harm we caused. The motion was seconded immediately, and the vote was unanimous. Not a single delegate opposing Siren rose to address the assembly, and silence fell across the chamber. I thank the council for this gesture, she said, but I must respectfully decline the apology. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the hall, and Zenith leaned forward with surprise written on her features. You decline. We do not need your sorry, Siren explained. We need your promise. Because what happened to humanity could happen to any young species that brings an unpopular truth before this body. She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes that represented civilizations far older than her own. When the next newcomer brings a warning that seems impossible, you will listen, and when they seem foolish or frightened, you will remember that we were once called the same. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. That is all we ask. Zenith was silent for a long moment, and then she rose from her seat. The Secretary General speaks wisdom, she declared. I move that this council pass a new law, stating that no species may ever be silenced for bringing a warning, no matter how improbable it may seem. Again, the vote was unanimous, and Siren felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she had carried for 5 long years finally releasing after the session ended. She returned to the memorial wall, wanting a moment alone with her thoughts. She found someone already there, a Torvax who wore the insignia of a supply officer, standing before the plaque for Lieutenant Park Minjin. He turned at her approach, and Siren recognized the patterns on his gray skin. Sarix now, she said. I remember your name from the reports. You came to our border seeking help. He bowed, his head in acknowledgement. I was young and foolish and thought I could make a difference. He replied, your people taught me the weight of silence. You placed these flowers every week since the memorial was built, because he gave his life for my people, even though we did not deserve it, and I wanted someone to remember. Siren studied him for a moment. Seeing the pain and gratitude mixed in his expression, he did not die for the Torvax, she said gently, or for the Ilari or for any single species. He died because he believed that all lives have value, even the lives of those who wronged us. Sarex now looked at her with something like wonder. Humans are strange beings, he said. You hold grudges less than any species I have ever known. Siren smiled slightly. We hold grudges plenty, but we also believe in second chances, and we believe that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats those who have been its enemies. She placed her own hand on the memorial wall, feeling the names beneath her fingers. Lieutenant Park believed that, she said, and so do I. Later that evening, as the stars wheeled overhead and the rebuilt station hummed with new life, Siren was approached by a young delegate, an insectoid. Being from a species that had joined the council only 3 years ago, the young ambassador was nervous, her wings fluttering with anxiety, and she held a data tablet pressed against her thorax like a shield. Secretary General, she began hesitantly. I have readings from our survey ships that suggest unusual activity in the far reaches of unexplored space, and my government believes it may indicate a new threat. But the other delegates say my species is too young to understand what we are seeing. Siren looked at her for a long moment, remembering another young ambassador who had stood before this council with unwelcome news around them. She could see other delegates beginning to dismiss the newcomer with impatient gestures and skeptical expressions. Wait, Siren said, and her voice carried enough authority that everyone stopped. She walked to the young ambassador and placed a hand on her shoulder. Show me your data, she said. Tell me everything your people have observed, and take your time. The young delegate's wings stopped fluttering, and her compound eyes shone with something like hope. You will listen, always, Siren promised. She turned to face the other delegates, her expression calm but unyielding. We will all listen, she declared, because we have learned what happens when we do not. And in the great chamber of the Galactic Council, surrounded by beings from 1,000 different worlds, humanity finally took its place. Not as conquerors or saviors, but as teachers. They taught the galaxy that wisdom is not a matter of age but of humility, and that the smallest voice can carry the greatest truth. They taught that silence can be a weapon and mercy can be a gift, and that the choice between them defines who we truly are. And they taught, above all else, that listening is the beginning of everything. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula would be remembered as the greatest disaster in galactic military history, though there would be few left alive to remember it if the tide did not turn soon. High Arbiter Drelax VR stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Torvax Supremacy, watching his fleet die around him as machines older than his civilization tore through shields and armor like paper. All ships, concentrate fire on the late elements, he commanded. But even as he spoke, he knew it was hopeless. The Veth did not fight like living beings. They did not make mistakes or feel fear or hesitate when their numbers dwindled. They simply continued advancing with the patience of a glacier grinding mountains to dust. His tactical officer, a veteran of 30 campaigns, turned to him with despair written on her face. High Arbiter, we have lost contact with the 7th and 9th battle groups, and the Ilari contingent is requesting permission to withdraw. Drelax Var felt something he had never experienced before, something that tasted like the ashes of his pride. Permission granted, he said quietly. All ships are to withdraw and regroup at Varentos Prime. The order went out across the fleet, and those ships that could still move began their desperate retreat. But the Veth did not allow easy escapes. The Torvax Supremacy shuddered as enemy fire struck her engines, and Drelax Vo gripped his command chair as alarms screamed throughout the bridge. Hull breach on decks 7 through 12. His damage control officer reported. Engineering reports reactor containment failing. HFY looked around at his crew, beings who had served him faithfully for decades, and he knew that they would all die here because of his pride. "Abandon ship," he ordered. "All hands to escape pods." His officers hesitated, looking at him with confusion. "High Arbiter, you must come with us." He shook his head slowly, feeling an odd sense of peace settling over him. "Someone must keep the ship fighting long enough for the pods to clear the combat zone," he said. "I brought us to this place with my arrogance, and I will not ask others to pay the price for my mistakes." He watched his crew leave the bridge one by one, and when he was alone, he turned back to face the view screen, where the Veth machines were closing in for the kill. "I should have listened to the humans," he said to no one. And then the Torvax supremacy exploded in a flash of light that briefly outshone the nebula itself. The survivors of the Battle of the Crimson Nebula limped back to Varanthos Prime. And when the people of the station saw how few ships remained, a great wailing arose from every quarter. Prelate Zenith, now acting leader of what remained of the council, stood in the great chamber where she had once voted to silence humanity and tried to find words that could give her people hope. "The enemy is coming," she announced. "Our fleet is broken and our allies are scattered, but we will not surrender and we will not despair." Even as she spoke, she knew her words were empty. The Veth would reach Varanthos Prime within days, and when they arrived, nothing would stop them from completing the genocide they had begun 40,000 years ago. She returned to her quarters and stared at the stars, wondering if this was how all civilizations ended. Crushed beneath the weight of their own pride, a soft chime announced a visitor, and when she turned, she found her assistant Silas standing in the doorway. "Prelate, there is something you must see." Silas led her to the station's observation deck, where a single small ship waited at the docking port, unmarked and unremarkable except for the fact that it should not have been able to pass through the Veth lines. A hatch opened and a figure emerged, and as Zenith felt her breath catch in her throat, Ambassador Yoon Siren looked exactly as she had 18 months ago, calm and dignified and utterly unbroken despite everything that had been done to her. "Prelate Zenith," Siren said with a slight bow. "I apologize for arriving unannounced." Zenith stared at her for a long moment, then fell to her knees. The gesture was spontaneous and utterly sincere, and she did not care that beings from a dozen different species were watching. She did not care that she was the leader of the oldest civilization in known space, kneeling before a representative of one of the youngest. "Ambassador," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "We were proud, and we were fools. And I do not ask you to save us, but only to witness what our pride has cost." Siren stood very still, and Zenith could not read the expression on her human face. "I watched the battle," Siren said quietly. "I watched Relax Vyre die trying to save his crew, and I watched your ships burn in the nebula." She paused, and Zenith felt tears sliding down her crystalline features. "I watched," Siren continued, "and I thought about what it means to be civilized. And I thought about revenge and justice and mercy. And I thought about all the beings who will die if we do nothing." She reached down and took Zenith's hand, pulling the Yalari prelate to her feet. "We never stopped watching," Siren said, "and we never stopped preparing. But we also never stopped hoping that we would not have to prove you wrong." She squeezed Zenith's hand with surprising strength. "Rise, prelate, because humanity does not need your knees. We need you standing beside us, and we need you to help us save everyone who is left." Zenith stood on trembling legs and looked into the eyes of the human ambassador. "You came alone," she said. "Does this mean your government has agreed to help?" Siren smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Zenith had ever seen from a human. "I did not come alone," she replied. She turned and gestured toward the viewport, and as Zenith followed her gaze, space rippled, and ships began appearing. emerging from hiding places they had maintained throughout the long months of silence. 300 warships painted in the dark colors of Earth's military, their hulls unmarked and their weapons ready. The human silent fleet, Siren announced. Admiral Kan Do-hyun commands. And he's waiting for your order to begin joint operations. Zenith felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time in months. My order, she repeated. You are offering to place your fleet under Council command. Siren shook her head. No. Prelate, I am offering to stand beside you as equals. Because that is what we always wanted. Not to rule and not to serve, but simply to be heard. She held out her hand. Will you listen to us now? Zenith took the offered hand without hesitation. Tell me everything, she said, and I promise that I will hear every word. Admiral Kan Do-hyun had spent 40 years preparing for this moment. And now that it had arrived, he felt nothing but the cold clarity of a warrior who knows exactly what must be done. The human silent fleet moved through space, like a school of predators. 300 warships operating in perfect coordination, without a single unnecessary transmission. Their crews communicating through secure tight beam lasers that left no trace for enemy sensors to detect. Admiral, his tactical officer, reported. The Veth advance force is entering optimal engagement range. Kang Do-hyun studied the holographic display that showed the enemy formation. Countless machines arranged in patterns that had not changed in 40,000 years. And he allowed himself a small smile. Signal all ships, he ordered. Execute attack pattern monsoon. The human fleet split into dozens of smaller groups, each one targeting a specific section of the Veth formation. And when they struck, it was with a ferocity that the ancient machines had never encountered. Human ships fought differently than any other species in the galaxy, darting and weaving through enemy fire with maneuvers that seemed reckless until you realized they were perfectly calculated. Sacrificing position for angles that let them concentrate fire on critical systems, the Veth adapted as they always did. But the humans adapted faster, changing tactics mid-battle, exploiting weaknesses that appeared for only seconds, turning the machine's own predictability against them on the bridge of the unyielding resolve. Kang Do-hyun watched his people fight and felt something like pride mixed with sorrow. They were winning this battle. But winning battles would not end this war, Admiral, his communications officer announced. Dr. Big Jia reports that the research team has located the Veth command nexus. It is a mobile station approximately 40 light-years behind their main fleet. Kang Do-hyun nodded slowly. He had known this moment would come. Known that all the fighting and sacrifice would eventually lead to a single desperate mission. Connect me to Dr. Beak, he ordered. Her face appeared on his screen. Exhausted but triumphant. Admiral, we have the shutdown codes. Complete and verified against multiple sources. But they must be transmitted directly into the Nexus core from close range. How close? Within the station's outer hull. Kang Do-hyun closed his eyes for a moment. That is a one-way mission. Yes. Admiral, it is. Silence stretched between them. Filled with understanding that needed no words, I will call for volunteers, he said finally before he could give the order. His communications console lit up with an incoming transmission, and Lieutenant Park Min-jin's young face appeared on the secondary display. Admiral, I am requesting permission to pilot the delivery mission. Kang Do-hyun looked at the young officer. Barely 25 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. You understand what you are asking for? Yes. Sir, I understand that someone must do this, and I'm the best pilot in the fleet. And I understand that I have no family waiting for me at home. And I understand that my life is a small price for the lives of billions. The Admiral wanted to refuse, wanted to find another way. But he had not become a military commander by letting emotions override necessity. Permission granted. Lieutenant Park, and may whatever gods exist watch over you. Min-jin's ship. The Quiet Resolve was a small, fast courier modified to carry the transmission equipment, and it launched from the fleet while the battle still raged around it on Varanthos Prime. The ground war had begun. Sergeant First Class Wang Sujin led her Marine squad through the corridors of the council chambers, their boots pounding on ancient stone as they raced to hold a defensive line that should have been impossible to hold. "Contact front," our pointman shouted. And then the machines were upon them. Veth ground units moved like nightmares made of metal, their bodies shifting and reforming to adapt to any obstacle. But the human Marines did not retreat. Sujin had trained for this her entire adult life, and she knew every trick in the book and several that had never been written down. "Grenades on my mark," she commanded. "Then fall back to the secondary position." The explosion tore through the lead machines, buying precious seconds, and her squad moved with the smooth efficiency of beings who trusted each other with their lives. Behind them, shuttle after shuttle launched from the council chambers, carrying alien leaders and civilians to safety, each launch making the sacrifice worthwhile. "Sergeant," one of her Marines called out, "we are running low on ammunition." Sujin checked her own supplies and found them similarly depleted. "Then we fix bayonets and hold as long as we can, 40 light years away." Lieutenant Park Min-jung guided the Quiet Resolve through a maze of enemy ships, using every skill he possessed to avoid detection. The Veth command nexus loomed ahead, a massive structure that looked like a twisted cathedral made of black metal, and Min-jun could feel its presence pressing against his mind like a cold whisper. "Quiet Resolve to Fleet Command," he transmitted, knowing this would be his last message. "I am beginning my final approach. Please tell my mother that I love her and that I am not afraid." He did not wait for a response. The small ship dove toward the Nexus, its engines screaming as Min-jun pushed them beyond their limits. And the Veth finally detected him and opened fire. Beams of energy sliced through space around him, and he dodged and weaved with movements that should have been impossible. Drawing on every reserve of skill and courage he possessed, the Nexus hull was ahead, a wall of darkness that promised death. And Min-jun aimed for a maintenance port that his sensors had identified. Impact came like a thunderclap, and the Quiet Resolve tore through the outer structure and plunged into the heart of the command. Nexus Min-jun had seconds left, his ship breaking apart around him, but his hands were steady as he activated the transmission. The shutdown codes poured out into the Veth network, spreading like wildfire through systems that had operated unchanged for 40 millennia. And then the Quiet Resolve exploded, taking Lieutenant Park Min-jun with it throughout known space. The Veth machines began to fall silent on Varanthos Prime. Sergeant Sujin watched in amazement as the units attacking her position simply stopped moving, their lights fading, their weapons falling quiet in the space around the station. The great Veth warships drifted without power, transformed in an instant from deadly predators to harmless debris. Admiral Kang Do-yun stood on his bridge and listened to the reports coming in from across the galaxy. Victory after impossible victory. And he thought about a young pilot who had given everything so that others might live. "All hands," he announced, his voice rough with emotion. "The mission is complete, and Lieutenant Park Min-jun has saved us all. Remember his name." Throughout the human fleet, crews stood in silence, honoring a hero who would never come home. 18 months had passed since humanity fell silent, and Prelady Zenith stood on what remained of Torvak's Mayan Colony 7, trying to understand how a world could die so completely. The planet had been home to 30,000 workers and their families, a small outpost by galactic standards, but still a place where beings had lived and loved and raised children. And now there was nothing left but ash and twisted metal and silence. Her assistant, a young Ilari named Celis, moved carefully through the wreckage with scanning equipment that hummed and clicked as it gathered data. "The energy signatures are unlike anything in our current records," Celis reported. her musical voice trembling slightly. But there are partial matches in the deep archives. Asenath closed her eyes and felt the weight of 40,000 years pressing down upon her shoulders. She had been young when the Veth convergence last threatened the galaxy, barely more than a child by Alari standards. But she remembered the stories her elders had told, the warnings they had passed down through countless generations. The humans were right, she said quietly, and the admission tasted like poison on her tongue. Celis looked up sharply, her crystalline features catching the pale light of the ruined world's dying sun. Prelate, surely there could be another explanation. There is no other explanation, Asenath replied. I voted to silence them because I was proud, and because I did not want to believe that a species so young could see what we had missed. She turned away from the destruction and walked back toward her shuttle, her robes trailing through the gray dust that had once been buildings and bodies and dreams. Send a message to the council, she ordered. Tell them what we have found and tell them that I recommend immediate military mobilization. The message reached Varanthos Prime within hours, and the council convened an emergency session. And for the first time in 18 months, someone suggested that perhaps humanity should be contacted. High Arbiter Drelax Vior, who had led the charge to silence Earth's delegation, dismissed the idea with a wave of his forearms. We do not need the humans, he declared. The Torvax fleet is the largest in known space, and whatever is attacking our colonies will fall before our might. No one mentioned that the Torvax fleet had already sent 3 patrol squadrons to investigate the disappearances, and none of those ships had returned far away in the Sol system. Admiral Kandoyan stood on the bridge of the battleship Unyielding Resolve and watched his fleet grow stronger with each passing day. 300 warships now orbited Earth and her colonies, each one built in secret shipyards hidden in the asteroid belt. Each one designed with a single purpose in mind. Admiral, his communications officer reported. We are detecting increased traffic on Council emergency channels. An analysis suggests they are experiencing significant losses in the outer rim. Kang Do-yoon nodded slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He was 63 years old and had spent his entire career preparing for a war that most humans believed would never come. And now that war was arriving exactly as the old records had predicted. Continue monitoring, he ordered, but maintain communication silence with all non-human vessels. In another part of the ship, Dr. Big Gia worked in a laboratory filled with ancient texts and holographic displays, her team of scientists racing against time to unlock secrets that have been buried for 40 millennia. The Alari archives contain more than they realized, she explained to her assistant, a young man named Choi Taiwu, who had given up a comfortable university position to join this desperate research effort. The original builders of the Veth included shutdown protocols, emergency codes that could disable the entire network. Taiwu looked at the scrolling data with amazement. If we can find these codes, we could end the threat without fighting. We could, Gia agreed. But finding them requires accessing the complete Veth command structure, which means getting a ship close enough to transmit directly into their central nexus. She did not mention that such a mission would almost certainly be one way, and Taiwu was smart enough not to ask on a small world near the border between human space and Council territory. A young Torvax officer named Serix now made a decision that could cost him everything. He had been raised to believe in the superiority of his species, taught that humans were primitive and foolish and unworthy of respect. But he had also been trained to analyze data and draw conclusions based on evidence rather than prejudice. The evidence told him that his people were losing a war they did not even acknowledge existed. He took a small scout ship and crossed into human territory, following protocols that should have announced his peaceful intentions. And when he reached the border, he was met by a wall of silence. Human patrol vessels surrounded his ship, but did not fire. And when he transmitted requests for communication, they did not respond. And when he begged for an audience with anyone who would listen, they simply watched him. With sensors that felt like cold eyes in the darkness, he waited for 3 days, sending message after message, explaining that he believed the humans had been right, apologizing for what his people had done, pleading for help that his own government was too proud to request. On the 4th day, the human ship simply moved aside, creating a corridor back to council space. And Serix now understood that he had been dismissed without a single word. He returned home with shame burning in his heart. And when he tried to tell his superiors what had happened, they stripped him of his rank and assigned him to a supply depot far from the front lines. The front lines grew closer every day as the Veth convergence continued its advance. 3 months after Serix Now's failed mission, the machines reached the Ilari homeworld of Thesser, where the sacred temples of their greatest prophet had stood for 60,000 years. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the temples were dust and 3 billion Ilari were dead. And Prelate Zenith knelt in the council chamber and wept tears that glowed like liquid starlight. "We must contact the humans," she said through her grief. "We must beg them for help." High Arbiter Drelax Var, whose own worlds were now under direct threat, finally agreed. The first message to Earth was formal and dignified. A request for military assistance in accordance with ancient treaties that humanity had never actually signed. Earth did not respond. The second message was less formal, acknowledging that perhaps mistakes had been made and offering to discuss restoration of humanity's council rights. Earth did not respond. The third message was written by Drelax Vor himself, a proud warrior reduced to pleading, promising anything and everything if only the humans would send their ships. Earth did not respond. The silence that the council had imposed upon humanity was being returned with interest. And every day, the machines drew closer to the heart of galactic civilization. The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like the inside of a giant shell, its walls carved from stone that had witnessed 10,000 years of alien diplomacy. An ambassador Yoon Siren stood at its center, feeling very small and very determined. She was the voice of 8 billion humans, a species that had only joined this ancient gathering 80 years ago. And today she carried a warning that no one wanted to hear. "Honored delegates," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of countless alien eyes upon her. "I bring evidence of a threat that could destroy everything we have built together." The chamber hummed with translator devices, converting her words into 100 different languages. And she watched the faces of beings who looked nothing like her, creatures of scales and feathers and crystalline skin, all of them wearing expressions she had learned to read over 20 years of service. High Arbiter Drelax Vor of the Torvax hegemony leaned forward in his elevated seat, his forearms crossed over his barrel chest in a gesture she knew meant contempt, and his gray skin rippled with patterns of purple that signaled amusement to those who understood Torvax body language. "Continue, Ambassador," he said, though his tone made the title sound like an insult. Siren activated her holographic display, and images filled the air above her head, showing sensor readings and scattered reports from the Outer Rim territories. 3 human survey vessels have detected energy signatures matching ancient records, she explained, keeping her language simple and clear. "The Veth convergence is awakening." Silence fell across the chamber, but it was not the silence of fear. And Siren felt her heart sink as she recognized it as the silence that comes before mockery. Prelate Zenith of the Ilari Concordat, an ancient being whose species had walked among the stars when humans still lived in caves, raised one slender hand, and her voice came out like music played on glass. "The Veth have been dormant for 40,000 years, Zenith said. Your species has existed for a fraction of that time, and you presume to tell us about threats we faced when your ancestors were still learning to make fire. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Siren stood her ground, even as she felt the hostility pressing against her like a physical force. "The evidence speaks for itself," she replied. "Our scientists have analyzed the readings, and they match historical records perfectly. So, I am not asking you to trust human judgment alone, but to examine the data yourselves." High Arbiter Drelax VOR rose from his seat, and at 3 meters tall, he towered over every other being in the room, his shadow falling across Siren like a threat made visible. "I have heard enough," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber. "For 80 years, we have tolerated humanity's presence in this council, and we have watched your kind stumble through galactic politics like children playing at adulthood. But this is too much." He pointed one thick finger at Siren, and his eyes burned with anger that seemed far too intense for the situation. "You come before us with ghost stories," he continued. "You waste our time with fairy tales about ancient machines. And you expect us to panic because your primitive sensors detected some unusual readings in empty space." Siren opened her mouth to respond, but Drelax VAR cut her off with a sharp gesture. "The Torvax hegemony moves for censure," he announced. "Humanity has proven itself unworthy of a voice in this chamber, and I propose that Earth's delegation be stripped of speaking rights for 50 cycles as punishment for spreading panic among civilized peoples." The chamber erupted in voices, some raised in protest and others shouting agreement. And Siren stood perfectly still at the center of the storm she had somehow created. Prelate Zenith called for order. And when the noise finally died down, she looked at Siren with eyes that held something like pity mixed with ancient superiority. "The motion has been made," Zenith said. "Those in favor of silencing humanity's voice will signal now." Lights flickered across the chamber as delegates voted, and Siren counted them with growing despair. Watching species she had considered friends turn against her, seeing alliances she had spent years building crumble in moments. The final count appeared in glowing numbers above the High Arbiter's seat, and the result was overwhelming. "The motion carries," Drelax VAR announced with obvious satisfaction. "Humanity is hereby stripped of speaking rights in this council for 50 cycles, and Earth's delegation will remain silent on all matters until such time as this body sees fit to restore their voice." He looked down at Siren with triumph written across his alien features. "You may stay and observe," he added, "but you will not speak. And perhaps in silence you will learn the wisdom that your species so clearly lacks." Siren felt the eyes of the entire galaxy upon her, waiting to see how the human would react to this humiliation. Expecting perhaps anger or tears or desperate pleading, she gave them none of these things. Instead, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of that ancient chamber. "The Council has made its decision," she said, "and humanity will honor it, but I want every being in this room to remember this moment. Because when the darkness comes, and it will come, you will wish you had listened." She paused and let her gaze travel across the assembled delegates, memorizing their faces. "We will remember this silence," she finished. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber with steady steps. And behind her, the delegates returned to their business as if nothing important had happened. Within a week, every human ship had withdrawn from Council space, and Earth's communications went dark, and the galaxy continued spinning without giving much thought to the small blue world that had tried to warn them on Earth. Secretary General Park Jun-won called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Government, and when Ambassador Siren delivered her report, he listened without interruption. "They would not hear us," she said simply. Park Jun-won nodded slowly, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor despair. "Then we will prepare alone," he replied. "And when the time comes, we will decide whether those who silenced us deserve our help." Siren thought about that question for a long time afterward. And she suspected that the answer would define not just humanity's future, but the future of every species that had voted against them. The stars continued to shine. Indifferent to the pride of empires, and somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, ancient machines began to stir.